Greetings there, everybody. It's Gleekon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, we did a little short recap of Sylvanas' approach to ruling the undead. First, things we've already done, where she beat down Baramathras and kind of made him subservient to her. And then the second half of it was how she will eventually retake the capital city of Lordaeron, make it named the Undercity, how she'll take the undead race and make them the Forsaken, all of those things that we know have to happen before World of Warcraft. So stay a while and listen as we begin our journey through the Sylvanas novel with chapter 14. This is the third part of the novel. We've already read a couple chapters. We're going to read all of them in a row. So of the third part, we're going to finish out this because it really details just what's going on with her during the time period, but it doesn't touch on too much of the scenes that happen in the game. So here we go with chapter 14 of Sylvanas. Sylvanas had always disliked failure, but never more than now when she'd had Arthas right where she wanted him, only to have victory plucked from her fingers. She always disliked failure. I've yet to be the person that's like, you know what? I really love failing. It was unlikely she would ever have such a clean opportunity again. Arthas, and perhaps even the Lich King who commanded him, was her pledged target. Yet this was a hunt she could not complete alone. Her banshees, her rangers, had done what they could, but they were not enough. Hard and perhaps fruitless as it would be, Sylvanas needed allies she could trust. Allies who also hated the Death Knight and wished to put an end to him. She realized she could not find them among the dead. Somehow, some way, she needed to convince the living. A daunting task, to be sure, but so was keeping her own mind. So was breaking away from the fierce grasp of the former Pale King and finding and claiming her own body again. Sylvanas had friendships once. Tight, seemingly unbreakable bonds. Had Arthas destroyed these too, as he had destroyed so much of her world? She had to believe he had not, because to think otherwise would be to let go of the last remaining shining thread of hope, and Sylvanas refused to do so. Still stinging from the failure, Sylvanas once again found herself heading toward Quel'The the Loss, this time to recover not her body, but hopefully her friendships. There were two whom she believed would listen long enough for her to prove that despite everything, even death, she was still the Sylvanas they knew. They would doubt at first, of course. What she had done while under the control of Arthas and the king who commanded him could not be dismissed. Sylvanas did not like to recall that dreadful moment, floating with no choice, unable to look away, let alone stop her actions, as her voice had been used as a weapon of mass slaughter. But she could explain. They would see how she had struggled, and of course, they would need little urging to destroy the true monster who had left a scar on the brightest place in Azeroth, a scar that would likely never fully heal. Once they understood, perhaps they would let her rejoin the unit she once commanded, maybe even lead it again. Perhaps it was reckless of her to hope for so much, but then again, Sylvanas had never been known to think small. Yeah, it seems like she's setting herself up for like this vicious heartbreak that's going to make her really resentful. She made it to the cover of the trees surrounding Far Strider Retreat, moving silent as a shadow in the familiar boughs once silvered by moon's light. Now, though, a haze of smoke hit the radiant orbs, and there seemed to be fine dust over every leaf. Now, I've noticed that Christy Golden here writes moon's light instead of moonlight, but now I just made the connection. Oh yeah, there's two moons on Azeroth, so it would be moon's light. The thick air had a lingering reek of burned flesh. Sylvanas had almost convinced herself that the task would be an easy one. It made sense. Everyone benefited, and they knew her better than anyone. There was no stirring from anything other than the night's creatures, so she settled herself and, still as a stone, simply waited. Dawn came, but no sign of those she was expecting. She was patient, though. Finally, in the late afternoon, they came, just the two of them, as Sylvanas had hoped. She prepared to drop from the trees at once, but something held her back. She would control how and when she revealed her new form, and wait for the right moment. She watched them carefully through the spaces in the gently moving leaves, observing that their bodies moved stiffly like those of aged men. When Lorthamar turned his head in her direction, Sylvanas saw that one eye was covered with a patch. Arthas had wounded them all in so many different and painful ways. Haldoran, so lively and cheerful, looked to have aged 1,000 years, as Lirath had looked when he had pleaded with her. Sylvanas ruthlessly shoved the memory aside and listened. At first there was nothing but the deeply familiar creak of leather, the song of the arrow, the faint thunk as it struck the distant targets. At last Haldoran lowered his bow. "It feels so strange," he said quietly. His normally warm baritone with an almost constant undercurrent of amusement was flat and cold. "You were never so. It is as if nothing has changed, but everything's changed. A few miles to the west and south." He fell silent, but still didn't reach for another arrow. "It feels wrong to be here, practicing as if it were any ordinary day. With 8 for every 10 of us dead." It was Lorthamar, his voice quiet and heavy. Sylvanas had thought that little would shock her, but this news did. She was aware a massive number of her people had been slaughtered, but the number was almost impossible to comprehend. Yeah, 80% of the High Elves are gone. "This is the first day we have had half a moment to do anything resembling ordinary, my friend," Lorthamar continued. "For what seems like an eternity, our days have been spent gathering and burning the bodies. I know." So the fine dust Sylvanas had noticed earlier was the ashes of Arthas's victims. The Quel'Drai had been burning the corpses to prevent them from rising. Lorthamar set another arrow to the bow, aimed, shot. "I dream of them," he said. "The bodies." "Which ones?" Alderon asked. Humor was in his voice now, but it was grim and cruel and cutting. "The ones we burned, the ones we buried, or the ones we had to cut down twice?" "The ones still in the scar," Lorthamar said, his voice as haunted as the lands through which she traveled to reach the retreat. From her perch in the highest branches, Sylvanas could glimpse the twisting of the land that Lorthamar had appropriately called the scar. She had not wanted to think about it, but Haldoran's words forced her to see, to remember. Arthas had not taken all his undead with him when he left. Scores of them still shuffled about, their single purpose to attack the living. She saw other dead in the scar, too. Corpses that had not been reanimated yet could not safely be retrieved by the living. They would decompose, returning to the soil, but were exiled from the cycle of life, death, and renewal. Their bones would lie there until all memory of whom they had been had faded, their names lost to the wind. A fresh wave of hatred swept through Sylvanas, threatening to carry her away with its intensity. Even now the shadow of Arthas Menethil loomed over her homeland. She wondered if it would ever recede from the land and from the hearts and spirit of her people. But one thing was for certain. The 2 men below her, going through the motions of normalcy, hollow-voiced and dull-eyed, would be more than ready to join her in the hunt to slay him. The perfect moment had come. Sylvanas was about to jump from her perch and begin her well-rehearsed speech, to reassure them that they could trust and ally with her, and so take down the hated Arthas together. But before she could do so, Haldoran's words made her freeze. "Sylvanas is the one who comes in my nightmares. That ghostly thing, obeying the butcher's commands." His voice grew ragged. "All those innocents, Lorthamar, and that terrible cry, as if the obscenity was pained by what it was doing, yet unable to disobey." Lorthamar went to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "And that, my old friend, is how we know Sylvanas truly is no more. She would have found a way to resist, even if it destroyed her. I will never claim to be able to dispel nightmares. If I could, I would start with my own. But I will tell you this. The monster that murdered so many was nothing of our old friend, and I believe with my whole heart she would be horrified to know that her image was used to turn harm upon those she died defending." Do you think she has found some kind of peace?" Haldoran sounded hopeful, wanting to be assured. "I do. I must. She is gone, and truth be told, I am glad of it. She would weep to see what has befallen our people. Of that you may be certain. Those whom the butcher raised, it It will take time, but eventually we will send them as well to the eternal rest that was denied them. Had she lived, had she still had lungs she did not need to command, Sylvanas would have stopped breathing. Monster. So they had named her. So they saw her now. So they would see her were she to reveal herself and try to speak to them. There was nothing she could say or do to convince them that she had been used against her will. These two old friends would not believe that she had wrested that will back, that she was herself, and maybe they were right. Another memory flashed, fully formed, though it had been lost to her till just this instant. A young woman showing off a bow to two notable forest riders. I bet you will be telling stories about me when I join the forest riders, she had told Lorthamar. And so he would, but they would be dark and bitter tales. That's a way off. Eldaron had been so flippant and light then. Not that far. You're hardly ancient. She has you there, Lorthamar had said. Playful teasing. Dreams of glory. There was a sharp, stifled sob. When he spoke, Eldaron's voice was shaking and broken. I miss her, Lorthamar. As do I, but she would not want us to grieve. Let us remember her as she would wish us to, as our friend. Sharp-tongued, brilliant, so full of life and passion. That will always be our Sylvanas, not the monster who bears her face. There was no point in lingering. Sylvanas had her answer. How foolish she had been in life, thinking it was noble for the forest riders to shelter her people from the cruelty and darkness of the world. And even now in this unlife of hers, this was what came of such naivete, an inability to comprehend and accept anything but absolutes. Sylvanas was dead, and yet not, and therefore even those who knew her, down to her bones. She was no different from the mindless wretches who prowled the scar. This time, when the thought of her brother crept into her mind, Sylvanas was unable to shut it out. She could not help but wonder if Lyrath would have felt the same way as Lorthamar and Halduran. Would he have been able to see his Lady Moon inside a corpse? If anyone would have been willing to listen, to believe in her, surely it would have been him. The world is different now, Lyrath had said. That was a world of softness, of privilege, of wine and song and laughter and family. That world's gone now, and it's never coming back. Of all of us, I thought you would believe in me, but you don't. Words and the memories of them were the blades that cut the deepest. Regardless, he was dead, and she had been responsible for that. His grave was nearby, but Sylvanas could not bring herself to visit it. She left her friends to their shattered idealism and their narrow minds, departing as silently as she had arrived, barely disturbing the dust of the dead that lay like a mort-cloth of the land she had once loved. Sylvanas tried, but she could not conceal her feelings from her loyal rangers. They floated about their mistress, concerned. You seem troubled, mistress. Sylvanas could not bear to tell them how they were now perceived by their fellow forest riders, so she turned to a different subject. Curse of undeath. Aren't you, sister? Sylvanas replied. Only days ago we were the Lich King's slaves. We existed solely to slaughter in his name. She could hear the sorrow and frustration in her own echoing voice. The banshees regarded one another. I don't understand, mistress. Our wills are our own now. Is that not what we fought for? I thought you'd be overjoyed. The words irritated her further. How could she be overjoyed with their freedom when all it meant in the end was that they were free to fully understand their own suffering? How could she find joy in anything anymore? What joy is there in this curse? We are still undead, sister. Still monstrosities. She looked down at her arms, blue-gray. Dead. She had fought so hard to recover her body, reconnect with that last part of herself, and yet she could find nothing of delight in it. What are we if not slaves to this torment? Her brooding was interrupted by a familiar sound, the odd echoing whirring of a demonic portal. She watched, wary but curious, as Varamathras appeared. I think this is a cutscene we've already done. Sylvanas listened with half an ear as he lavished praise upon her and her efforts to overthrow Arthas, paying true attention only when he said, I've come to offer you a formal invitation to our new order. Now, that The words of her erstwhile friends had cut her deeply. They had not robbed her of her wits. Sylvanas had labored mightily to rid herself of the bonds Arthas had placed upon her. She would not throw that away only to become another lackey. The clearly artificial formality irritated her, and her voice was harsh as she replied. Veramathris, she said, speaking coldly and clearly as if to a disobedient child. My only interest is in seeing Arthas dead. It was still her only goal, made all the more urgent by the fact that she could no longer rely upon those who had readily obeyed her orders in life. I have no time for your petty politics or power-mongering. Sylvanas made no effort to hide her disdain, and Veramathris did not like it. He strode forward, oddly graceful on his long goat legs, and the sophisticated veneer vanished. Careful, my lady, he said, his voice low and heavy with threat. You would be unwise to incur our wrath. We are the future of... He hesitated, then continued. These plague lands. You can either join us in rule, or be cast aside. The Dreadlords thought themselves so superior, and she knew they were indeed without conscience and very powerful. Even so, she marveled at how similarly the power-hungry types all behaved, be they Quel'Dari Lesser Lords, or Death Knights, or demons. Her tongue was sharp and perhaps a bit too unbridled as she shot back. I lived as a slave long enough, Dreadlord. I won't relinquish my freedom by shackling myself to you fools. Veramathris was furious. He could barely control himself as he ground out, So be it! Our reply will come soon. He was scowling as the magic of the demonic portal bore him back to his brothers. Sylvanas could make a guess as to what that reply might be. Would it not have been prudent to accept his offer? Charlindra asked. Another might call it wisdom, Sylvanas agreed, but I call it folly. She refused to serve ever again. From this moment on, Sylvanas would do as she had in life, command, find those who would follow. The living had scorned her, the demons were untrustworthy. Who then would be her new army, one suited to her new existence? Only the dead in the dark. The reference to the plague lands was clear. They wanted to control the undead as Arthas had. Sylvanas refused to allow them to do so. There was an entire city inhabited by those who, like her, had once lived, loved, drawn breath. They had been under Arthas's control, too, those unfortunate of Lordaeron. Another unwanted memory flashed through her mind. You know, it's said in Lordaeron that high elves are the finest archers in the world, Nathanos Maris had said. Oh, we are. It's also said in Lordaeron that they are the most stuck-up, arrogant, self-centered, and vain people in the world. Both descriptions are quite true. Nathanos would not have been in the capital when Arthas arrived and released chaos and cruelty upon the populace. His family's farm, Maris Stead, was located in the Eastweald, now dubbed Eastern Plaguelands, as if it had never had a name before Arthas. Old names, old lives, they didn't matter. Not anymore. She had visited him there, lain with him in the little bed, woken to the sound of bird calls, blinking sleepily as she lay in his arms. It was a simple, sweet, cruel memory, and it hurt so greatly her body cringed when she recalled it. She had loved him, though the word had not been shared between them, and now it was too late. She could remember the sights and smells and sensations, but not how she felt. Her emotions seemed to be limited, if nuanced, in their compactness. Had he fallen, for Nathanos? And if he had fallen, had he, like her, been able to claw his way back to sentience? Or had he beaten them? Was he one of the few who had managed to escape through their love of the light or their own cleverness or luck? That thought gave her no pleasure either. If Nathanos still lived, he would likely think of her the way her friends did. She was an abomination. The words from Lorthamar and Haldoran had been sufficiently cruel that she had no wish to invite the same scorn from one who had been so close to her, even from her own sister Verisa, whom she heard still lived. Sylvanas realized that at this moment it did not matter. She did not need a lover, or friends, or family. Arthas had taken them all from her the moment he took her life. One day, perhaps, once she had settled the score with Arthas, she could think again on such things. Her people had once been graceful, bright lovers of the sun and beauty. Some of them had been led by her, the sharp ones who tasted the harshness of fear and danger. She looked again at her rangers, her banshees. She thought of the little shade so happily saving her king's life. That child had been murdered by Arthas, no matter if he had dealt the killing blow or if one of his scourge had done so. Her ghost should not be serving him. And And the answers came easily, calmly, almost kindly. Her old friends thought her a monster. Sylvanas would show everyone what a true monster was. She would conquer and lead them. The demons sought to use her. She would use them. With a strong enough army, manipulated and controlled by her banshees, she could take them down one by one. Perhaps in the end they would serve her. Her people now awaited her arrival, though they did not yet know it. They were lost, confused, like the little shade. No longer scourged, but not yet something else. Something more, as she was. Abandoned by not only the living, but also by the real monster who had made them. She would start her army with them, the ones with whom she shared a unique hatred. They had been forsaken. Soon they would be wanted, and then they would be hers. See, that's a much cooler understanding of why, of a backstory to being called the Forsaken. I like that. Cool. All right, so we got another episode in the pipe, 5x5. Thank you all so much for watching and for listening. I appreciate you. See you next time on Lore of Warcraft.